The morning of December 16th, 1944, near Monschau, Germany, a forward observer from the American 405th Field Artillery Group crouched in a frozen observation post overlooking the Siegfried Line. Technical Sergeant William Crawford had been awake for 31 hours. His breath formed clouds in the darkness. Through his BC scope, he watched German infantry moving through the pre-dawn gloom, their shapes barely visible against the snow. Crawford reached for his radio handset. He called coordinates to the Fire Direction Center 7 miles behind the lines. What happened next would have been impossible 6 months earlier. Within 90 seconds, shells began falling on the German positions with accuracy that seemed supernatural, not the usual walking barrage that German soldiers had learned to anticipate and avoid. These rounds arrived in precise clusters, adjusted in real time as the targets moved. The German infantry scattered, but the shells followed them. A German officer, Hauptmann Klaus Becker of the 326th Volksgrenadier Division, later told American interrogators that his first thought was that they had been betrayed by a spy with a radio. There was no other explanation for artillery that knew where his men were going before they got there. The rounds seemed to track movement, to predict dispersion patterns, to arrive exactly where soldiers sought cover. This was not the artillery Becker had experienced in 4 years of war on the eastern and western fronts. This was something fundamentally different. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What Becker and thousands of German soldiers were experiencing that winter was the culmination of a technological revolution that had occurred largely in secret. American artillery had become coupled with radar fire control, systems that could track shells in flight, measure their trajectory against intended targets, and provide correction data in seconds rather than minutes. The system was called the SCR-584, paired with the M9 gun director. Together, they transformed artillery from an area weapon into something approaching a precision instrument. The transformation was invisible to the men receiving fire. They saw no new guns, no massive equipment that signaled technological change. The shells looked the same, sounded the same, killed the same way. But they arrived differently. They arrived with a consistency and accuracy that violated every lesson German soldiers had learned about surviving artillery fire. The old rules disperse, move laterally, seek the gaps between impact zones no longer applied. The shells found the gaps. The shells found the dispersal points. The shells arrived as if guided by observation that could see through fog, darkness, and smoke. This is the story of how American radar-guided fire control systems destroyed German confidence in their ability to maneuver under fire. It is not primarily a story about the Luftwaffe, though German aircrews would discover their own reasons to fear American radar. This is a story about Wehrmacht infantry, armor crews, and artillery officers who encountered a weapon system that invalidated their tactical doctrine. It is about the psychological cost of fighting against technology you cannot see, cannot counter, and barely understand. And it begins with understanding what German soldiers believed about artillery before December of 1944, beliefs built on 5 years of war across 2 continents. In 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, Wehrmacht artillery doctrine represented the refined lessons of the First World War, combined with innovations in mobile warfare. German gunners had trained extensively in indirect fire techniques. They understood ballistics, meteorology, and the diriyest mathematics of trajectory calculation. Their forward observers were skilled at estimating range and calling corrections. The system worked through careful planning, detailed fire tables, and experienced crews. German soldiers learned to respect artillery. They had experienced it at Verdun, where French guns had pulverized entire divisions. They knew what sustained bombardment could do to fortifications, to morale, to human bodies. But they also knew its limitations. Artillery was fundamentally imprecise. A battery firing at a target 5 miles away might achieve a circular error probable of 100 to 200 yards under good conditions. Under field conditions with wind, temperature variations, propellant inconsistencies, and tube wear affecting each shot, the dispersion was often greater. This imprecision created survivability. German infantry training emphasized dispersal. Soldiers learned to spread out, to use terrain, to move between impacts. Artillery killed through saturation, through putting enough shells into an area that some would find targets. But it was survivable if you understood the patterns. After the initial ranging rounds, you could predict where the battery was concentrating fire. You could identify the beaten zone and avoid it. You could wait for the barrage to shift and then advance through the area it had just devastated. German doctrine for attacking under artillery fire was well developed by 1944. Infantry advanced in dispersed formations with significant lateral spacing. When shells began falling, units scattered further, with individual soldiers or small groups seeking whatever cover was available. The key was to avoid concentration. Artillery could not kill what it could not concentrate fire upon. Once the barrage shifted, and it always shifted, because the enemy had limited ammunition and needed to cover multiple target areas, the infantry reformed and continued advancing. This doctrine had proven effective. In Poland, France, the Balkans, and across the vast expanses of the Soviet Union, German soldiers had learned to live with artillery. It was dangerous, certainly. It killed men every day, but it was a known quantity. You could develop skills to reduce your risk. Veterans taught new soldiers the tricks. Listen for the shells, judge their trajectory, determine if they were coming close or passing overhead. Watch for the pattern of impacts and move to where the fire was not concentrating. Above all, disperse. Make yourself a poor target. The guns firing at you could not see you through the smoke and dust they created. They were firing at map coordinates, at reported positions, at areas where you might be. If you moved intelligently, you could survive. German artillery officers understood these same limitations from the other side. They knew their guns could devastate area targets, towns, supply dumps, assembly areas where the enemy was concentrated. But moving targets, dispersed, infantry, tanks on the advance, these were much harder to engage effectively. You could put fire on them, certainly, but achieving decisive results required enormous expenditures of ammunition, and even then relied partly on luck. The enemy would be moving, seeking cover, dispersing in response to your fire. By the time your corrections reached the guns and they adjusted their aim, the target had often shifted position. This understanding of artillery's capabilities and limitations formed the foundation of German tactical thinking by 1944. It influenced everything from march discipline to defensive positions to counterattack planning. German commanders knew they needed to disperse their forces to survive enemy artillery. They knew they needed mobility to exploit gaps before enemy fire could concentrate. They knew that artillery preparation before an attack, while helpful, would not destroy a competent defender who used proper dispersion techniques. The Germans had also learned lessons about counter-battery fire. When your artillery fired, enemy forward observers could spot the muzzle flashes or the gun positions through binoculars. They would call fire missions on your batteries, but there was a significant time lag built into this process. The observer had to identify the position, estimate coordinates, call the fire mission back to his own fire direction center. The fire direction center had to calculate firing data and transmit it to the gun batteries. The guns had to traverse and elevate to the new target. Then they had to fire ranging rounds and adjust based on where those rounds actually landed. This entire process took minutes, often 10 to 15 minutes before effective fire landed on target. German artillery units exploited this time lag through shoot and scoot tactics. A battery would move into a prepared firing position, fire its mission, and immediately displace to a new location. If they were disciplined about this, and German artillery units generally were, they could be gone before counter-battery fire arrived. Even when enemy fire did arrive at their previous position, proper dispersion meant that individual guns might be separated by 50 or 100 yards. A shell landing in the center of the battery position might not damage any of the guns. You needed direct hits or very near misses to disable artillery pieces, and achieving that required either enormous volumes of fire or exceptional luck. By late 1944, German forces facing the Western Allies had developed a healthy respect for American artillery capabilities. American gunners had excellent maps, abundant ammunition, and well-trained forward observers. They could mass fire from multiple battalions onto a single target when needed. They used time-on-target techniques, where guns at different ranges fired at different times, so all shells arrived simultaneously, giving the enemy no warning and no chance to take cover after the first impact. These were sophisticated techniques that produced devastating results, but the fundamental nature of the weapon system remained unchanged from German perspective. American artillery was more abundant, better supplied, and skillfully employed. But it operated under the same physical and procedural limitations as all artillery. Shells took time to reach their targets. Adjustments took time to calculate and execute. Forward observers needed to see the target area to adjust fire effectively. In darkness, fog, or smoke, artillery accuracy degraded significantly. The laws of ballistics and the limitations of human observation and calculation created boundaries around what artillery could achieve. German soldiers understood these boundaries. They had learned to operate within them, to survive despite the constant threat of shell fire. Their tactical doctrine, their training, their instincts about when to move and when to take cover, all of this was built on 5 years of experience, with artillery as it had always been. What they encountered in December of 1944 would invalidate that experience. The boundaries had moved, the rules had changed, and German forces would pay an enormous price for assuming that artillery would behave as it always had. The SCR-584 radar set represented a convergence of technologies that had been developing separately since the late 1930s. The system emerged from work done at the Radiation Laboratory at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, established in October 1940, to develop microwave radar for military applications. The laboratory brought together physicists, engineers, and mathematicians who had been working in universities and private industry. By 1942, they had developed a tracking radar that could follow aircraft with sufficient precision to direct anti-aircraft artillery fire. The SCR-584 operated at a wavelength of 10 centimeters in the microwave portion of the radio spectrum. This frequency allowed for a narrow beam that could determine target position with far greater accuracy than earlier meter-wave radar systems. The antenna, a parabolic reflector approximately 6 feet in diameter, rotated and elevated under servo control. The system could track targets in azimuth and elevation simultaneously, providing continuous position data. What made the SCR-584 revolutionary for artillery was not its ability to detect targets German forces had encountered detection radar before. The innovation was in its tracking precision and its integration with automated fire control computers. The radar could track a shell in flight after it left the gun tube. It could measure the shell's actual trajectory against the calculated trajectory to the target. Within seconds, it could determine the deviation and provide correction data to the guns. The M9 gun director was the computational heart of the system. This was an AN, electromechanical analog computer, a massive assembly of gears, cams, and servo motors that weighed over 6,000 pounds. It received position data from the SCR-584 and calculated firing solutions in real time. The device could track a moving target, calculate where that target would be when the shells arrived, and determine the gun elevation and azimuth needed to hit that predicted position. It performed these calculations continuously, updating solutions multiple times per second. The integration of radar tracking and automated fire direction created capabilities that seemed impossible to soldiers trained in traditional artillery methods. A battery equipped with this system could engage targets obscured by smoke, fog, or darkness, with accuracy comparable to direct fire conditions. It could track moving targets and adjust fire to follow them. Most importantly, it could achieve first-round hits or near hits with probability far exceeding traditional methods. American forces began deploying SCR-584 systems in Europe in early 1944. Initially, these were used primarily for anti-aircraft defense. The system proved devastatingly effective against German aircraft. Luftwaffe pilots reported encountering anti-aircraft fire of uncanny accuracy, shells bursting at precisely their altitude, even when they changed course and speed. The radar tracked them through clouds and darkness. The proximity-fused shells detonated when they came within lethal distance of the aircraft, requiring no direct hit. By autumn of 1944, American artillery officers recognized that the same technology could be applied to ground targets. The SCR-584 could track friendly shells in flight and measure their deviation from the intended trajectory. This meant that ranging the traditional process of firing test rounds and observing where they landed could be eliminated. The radar observed where the shells were actually going and provided immediate corrections. A battery could achieve accurate fire on the first salvo, without the warning that ranging rounds traditionally gave to the enemy. Field artillery battalions began receiving SCR-584 systems in late autumn 1944. The 405th Field Artillery Group, supporting the 1st Army in the Ardennes sector, received their equipment in November. Technical personnel trained on the system for 3 weeks, learning to operate the radar, maintain the delicate electronics, and integrate the data into fire missions. Forward observers received minimal additional training. The system was designed to work within existing procedures. They called fire missions using standard methods. The difference was invisible to them, occurring entirely at the fire direction center and gun positions. The German Ardennes offensive began at 5:30 a.m. on December 16, 1944. 3 German armies, totaling over 400,000 men, attacked through the densely forested region along the Belgian-German border. The offensive achieved tactical surprise. American forces in the sector were relatively thin, with several divisions refitting after heavy fighting in the Hurtgen forest. Fog blanketed the region, grounding Allied aircraft and limiting visibility to a few dozen yards in many areas. The weather should have favored German forces. Their planning had specifically chosen this period because meteorologists predicted sustained bad weather that would neutralize Allied air superiority. Fog and low clouds would make forward observation for artillery difficult. German infantry and armor could advance through terrain where American defenders would have limited ability to see them, and even more limited ability to call effective artillery fire. The initial attacks broke through American lines in several sectors. German armor pushed west, trying to reach the Meuse River and split Allied forces. Infantry followed, exploiting the penetrations. For the first 48 hours, the offensive made significant progress. Then, German forces encountered something their planning had not anticipated. American artillery fire arrived through fog so dense that forward observers could see nothing. It arrived at night, in darkness so complete that German soldiers could not see their own hands in front of their faces. It arrived with accuracy that made no sense given the conditions. Shells landed on German columns moving through forests where no observer could possibly see them from American positions. Fire shifted to follow German units as they maneuvered, as if the American guns could track movement through terrain and weather that made visual observation impossible. Hauptmann Franz Kurowski, commanding a company of the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, recorded his experience in a letter written January 3, 1945, after his unit had been withdrawn from the offensive. The letter was intercepted by Allied sensors and translated. Kurowski described advancing through heavy fog on the morning of December 18th near the town of Bullingen. His company was moving in dispersed formation through a forest. No American forces were visible. His men could barely see each other in the fog. Suddenly, artillery fire began landing directly on his position. Kurowski wrote that his first assumption was that they had been spotted before entering the fog and the Americans were firing at their last known position. He ordered his men to move laterally, to break contact and shift to a parallel route. The company moved approximately 200 meters north and resumed their advance. Within minutes, artillery fire shifted to their new position. Again they moved, this time south of their original route. Again the fire adjusted, finding them in the fog. Kurowski counted 3 separate displacements, each time attempting to break contact. Each time, American fire found his unit within minutes of their movement. He recorded that discipline began to break down after the 4th displacement. Soldiers started to panic, convinced they were being tracked by spies or by some technology they did not understand. Several men refused to move, preferring to take cover in the forest rather than advance into what seemed like observed fire. Kurowski himself could not explain how American artillery was finding his unit. The fog remained impenetrable. No aircraft could be flying in such conditions. There were no prominent terrain features the Americans could use to predict German routes of advance. Yet the fire continued to arrive with precision that suggested direct observation. Similar reports came from across the German front. Units advancing at night reported artillery fire that tracked their movement. Armor columns moving through forests encountered fire that landed directly on them despite no line of sight to American positions. Most disturbing to German commanders, American counter-battery fire arrived on German artillery positions with unprecedented speed and accuracy. Batteries that fired and immediately displaced found American shells landing on their new positions before they could prepare to fire again. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. German intelligence officers struggled to explain what their forces were experiencing. Initial reports suggested widespread infiltration by American special forces equipped with radios, teams positioned deep behind German lines calling fire on troop movements. But the sheer scale of the accurate fire made this explanation implausible. The Americans would have needed hundreds of such teams, positioned throughout the entire offensive sector, maintaining radio contact under combat conditions. German security sweeps found no evidence of such infiltration. Alternative theories emerged. Some officers suggested the Americans had developed an infrared detection system that could see through fog by detecting body heat. Others proposed acoustic tracking, microphones that could hear German vehicles and calculate their positions. A few suggested that American aircraft were flying above the fog layer, using some unknown method to track German forces below the clouds and relay targeting data to artillery units. None of these theories adequately explained the observed accuracy. The fire arrived too quickly for aircraft-based observation, even assuming such observation was possible. Acoustic tracking could not provide the precision German forces were experiencing. Infrared technology of the era had very limited range and could not operate through dense fog. Yet the evidence was undeniable. American artillery was engaging targets it should not have been able to see, with accuracy that violated the known limitations of indirect fire. The psychological impact on German soldiers was significant. Artillery had always been dangerous, but it had been predictable within certain parameters. You dispersed, you used terrain, you moved between impacts, and you significantly improved your survival probability. These techniques required steady nerves and experience, but they worked. Now they did not work. Dispersal did not help when the shells followed your movement. Terrain did not matter when the enemy could apparently see through it. Moving between impacts was futile when the next salvo arrived at your new position rather than your old one. German casualties from artillery increased dramatically during the Ardennes offensive, despite the fog and limited visibility that should have protected advancing forces. The 12th Volksgrenadier Division reported that artillery caused 63% of their casualties during the first week of the offensive, compared to typical rates of 40 to 45% in previous operations. The percentage increased as German forces pushed deeper into American-held territory and came under fire from more artillery units equipped with radar fire control. By December 22nd, when clearing weather allowed Allied aircraft to resume operations, German forces were already experiencing the effects of a technology they did not understand and could not counter. The addition of air attacks to the precise artillery fire created conditions German doctrine had no answer for. Units could not concentrate for counterattacks without being devastated by artillery. They could not disperse too widely, or they lost unit cohesion. They could not remain stationary without being targeted. They could not move without being tracked. Oberst Rudolf Langhoser, Chief of Staff for the 5th Panzer Army, wrote in his after-action report that American artillery performance during the Ardennes offensive represented a qualitative change in the nature of indirect fire. He noted that traditional counter-battery techniques were ineffective because American fire direction was too fast. German batteries were being engaged before they could displace, sometimes before they had completed their fire missions. He reported that several batteries had been destroyed by counter-battery fire that arrived less than 3 minutes after they began firing. Not enough time to limber the guns and move, even if the crews abandoned proper displacement procedures. The revelation that American artillery could engage targets through conditions that should have made observation impossible forced German commanders to reconsider fundamental tactical assumptions. By early January 1945, as the Ardennes offensive stalled and German forces began withdrawing to defensive positions, Wehrmacht training bulletins began addressing the problem. A directive issued January 8 by Army Group B headquarters acknowledged that American forces possessed technical methods of fire direction that allow engagement of targets without direct observation. The directive did not explain the technology. German intelligence still had not determined the precise mechanism, but it attempted to provide tactical guidance. Units were instructed to minimize radio transmissions, on the theory that Americans might be using radio direction finding to locate German positions. They were told to avoid predictable routes and to vary their timing when conducting reliefs or resupply operations. Artillery units received orders to fire the absolute minimum number of rounds before displacing, preferably no more than a single salvo per position. These measures were essentially defensive acknowledgements of technological inferiority. German forces were being told to limit their own capabilities to use less artillery fire, to reduce maneuver, to avoid concentration, because they could not counter the American technical advantage. The guidance represented an abandonment of offensive doctrine. An army that cannot mass fires, cannot maneuver predictably, and cannot use terrain confidently is an army that can defend but cannot attack effectively. The psychological cost was equally significant. German soldiers who had survived years of combat on multiple fronts found themselves facing a weapon that violated their accumulated experience. Veterans who had developed instincts about artillery fire, when to move, where to take cover, how to judge danger, discovered those instincts were now unreliable. The learning that had kept them alive through previous battles no longer applied. Morale reports from German units in January and February 1945 consistently mentioned artillery as a primary concern. Soldiers reported feeling helpless against American fire. They described a sense that they were being watched constantly, that their movements were known, that nowhere was safe. This was not the normal fear that came with being under fire. It was a deeper anxiety born from not understanding the threat, from facing something that seemed to break the rules of warfare as they knew them. German attempts to capture intact SCR-584 systems failed during the Ardennes offensive. American units that risked being overrun destroyed their radar equipment rather than allow it to fall into German hands. In several cases, engineers placed demolition charges directly on the radar sets and fire direction computers, ensuring complete destruction, even if the position was overrun before the charges could be removed. The priority given to destroying this equipment, even over other sensitive materials, indicated American awareness of its value. By February 1945, German intelligence had pieced together a partial understanding of the American system. Interrogation of captured American artillery personnel, analysis of destroyed equipment found on the battlefield, and reports from agents in neutral countries provided fragments of information. German analysts determined that Americans were using centimeter-wave radar integrated with automated fire direction computers. They understood the basic principle radar tracking of shells in flight allowed real-time trajectory correction. This knowledge did nothing to help German forces counter the system. Germany had no equivalent technology deployed with field artillery units. German radar development had focused primarily on air defense and had not achieved the precision necessary for artillery fire control. Even if German engineers could have designed an equivalent system, there was no industrial capacity to produce it. By early 1945, German factories were under constant air attack, raw materials were scarce, and production was focused on maintaining existing weapon systems rather than developing new ones. The impact of American radar-guided artillery extended beyond the immediate tactical situation in the Ardennes. As Allied forces advanced into Germany proper in early 1945, German defenders encountered the same precision fire in every sector. The technology that had been deployed initially with relatively few units was now standard equipment across American artillery battalions. British and Canadian forces, sharing intelligence and equipment with the Americans, also began deploying similar systems. German defensive doctrine for 1945 had assumed that Wehrmacht forces could trade space for time, conducting fighting withdrawals that imposed maximum casualties on Allied forces while preserving German combat power for a final defense of core German territory. This doctrine required mobile defensive operations counterattacks to disrupt Allied advances, rapid maneuver to avoid encirclement, flexible response to enemy breakthroughs. All of these operations required the ability to concentrate forces, to move them under fire, and to survive artillery bombardment through dispersion and maneuver. American artillery technology made this doctrine unworkable. German forces attempting to concentrate for counterattacks were engaged with precision fire before they could launch their attacks. Units maneuvering to avoid encirclement found American artillery tracking their movement and inflicting casualties that degraded combat effectiveness. Static defense was impossible because American fire direction could systematically destroy prepared positions. Mobile defense was impossible because movement attracted immediate and accurate artillery response. The Rhine River crossings in March 1945 demonstrated the complete dominance American artillery had achieved. At Remagen, where American forces captured an intact bridge on March 7th, German attempts to concentrate forces for a counterattack to recapture or destroy the bridge were defeated almost entirely by artillery fire. German units moving toward Remagen were engaged by American artillery firing through fog and darkness. Counter-battery fire destroyed German artillery positions before they could effectively engage American forces crossing the river. A German artillery officer, Hauptmann Werner Plaskat, whose battery attempted to fire on the Remagen Bridge, later described the experience to American historians. His battery displaced to a position approximately 6 miles from the bridge, prepared firing data, and began engaging the American-held East Bank. His second salvo had not yet impacted when American counter-battery fire began landing on his position. The accuracy was such that his first gun was destroyed by the third American salvo, less than 2 minutes after his battery had opened fire. Plaskat ordered immediate displacement, but 2 more of his guns were destroyed before the battery could limber and move. He reported that the experience destroyed his gun crew's willingness to engage American forces. They understood that firing meant being destroyed before they could complete their mission. By April 1945, German artillery was essentially combat ineffective across much of the Western Front. Not because guns had been destroyed or ammunition exhausted, but because crews understood that firing meant rapid counter-battery response with precision that made survival unlikely. Artillery units that had fought effectively for years were refusing to engage, abandoning positions, or firing single salvos and immediately retreating beyond range of American counterfire. The psychological dominance was complete. The Eastern Front showed similar patterns where German forces faced Soviet artillery, though Soviet systems were less technologically sophisticated than American radar-guided fire control. The cumulative effect was that German forces in the final months of the war operated without effective artillery support, facing enemies who could employ their artillery with impunity. The disparity in fire support capabilities became one of the decisive factors in the rapid collapse of German defensive positions in early 1945. The war ended in May 1945 before the full implications of radar-guided artillery fire control could be absorbed into military doctrine. But the technology had demonstrated principles that would shape artillery development for decades. The integration of sensors, computers, and weapons into unified fire control systems became the standard approach for advanced militaries. The ability to engage targets without direct observation, to track moving targets and adjust fire in real time, to achieve first-round accuracy under conditions that previously made artillery ineffective, these capabilities became expected rather than extraordinary. For the German soldiers who experienced American radar-guided artillery in the final months of the war, the technology represented something beyond military innovation. It was evidence of a technological and industrial gap that could not be closed by courage, training, or tactical skill. German forces in early 1945 were not poorly trained or badly led. Many units consisted of veterans with years of combat experience. They understood their weapons and their tactics, but they were fighting with doctrines developed for a previous generation of technology against an enemy who had moved beyond those technological limitations. The psychological impact of this realization that the rules had changed, that accumulated experience no longer applied, that the enemy possessed capabilities you could not match or counter, was as significant as the physical casualties inflicted. It destroyed confidence in leadership that had sent soldiers into battle without warning them about the capabilities they would face. It created a sense of futility that eroded the will to continue fighting, even among units that remained physically capable of resistance. This was the irony that German forces confronted in the winter of 1944 and 45. They had launched an offensive designed to exploit weather conditions that would neutralize Allied advantages in air power and artillery observation. They had planned meticulously, concentrated their remaining armor and veteran infantry, and achieved tactical surprise. They had done everything their doctrine prescribed for success, and they encountered an enemy who could negate those advantages through technology their doctrine did not account for and that their intelligence had not adequately assessed. The hatred that developed among German soldiers for American artillery was not primarily about the physical destruction it inflicted, though that was certainly significant. It was about the helplessness of facing a weapon you could not understand, could not predict, and could not counter. It was about the violation of expectations, the sense that the fundamental nature of warfare had changed without warning. Artillery had always been dangerous, but it had been comprehensible. You could develop skills to survive it. Now, those skills were worthless, and there were no new skills to learn because the technology was beyond German capacity to match. Technical Sergeant William Crawford, the forward observer who had called fire on German positions on the morning of December 16th, survived the war. He returned to the United States in July 1945 and was discharged in September. In interviews conducted decades later, he recalled that day in December, but had little understanding of why his fire missions had been so effective. He had called coordinates using the same procedures he had learned in training. The shells had arrived faster and more accurately than in previous missions, but he attributed this to improved crew training and better equipment generally, not to any specific technological innovation. Crawford never knew about the SCR-584 radar tracking his shells, about the M9 director calculating corrections, about the automated fire control that made his missions so devastatingly effective. The technology was invisible to him, operating behind the scenes to amplify his capabilities without his awareness. This too was significant. The men calling fire did not need to understand the technology. It worked transparently, making them more effective without requiring additional training or procedures. The complexity was hidden, the benefits automatic. Hauptmann Klaus Becker, who had suspected a spy was directing artillery fire against his positions, was captured in January 1945 when American forces overran his unit's defensive position. He learned about radar-guided fire control during interrogation, when American intelligence officers explained the system to assess his knowledge of Allied capabilities. Becker's reaction, recorded by the interrogator, was one of resignation rather than surprise. He stated that he had known German forces were technologically outmatched, but had not understood the extent of the disparity. Learning about the artillery fire control system simply confirmed what he had already concluded, that Germany had been fighting a war it could not win against industrial powers, whose technological capabilities were years ahead. The story of American radar-guided artillery in World War II is ultimately a story about the intersection of technology, psychology, and combat effectiveness. The technology itself was remarkable, a successful integration of emerging radar capabilities with fire control computers to create a weapon system that fundamentally changed artillery's role on the battlefield. But the psychological impact was perhaps more significant than the physical destruction. German forces learned that their understanding of warfare was obsolete, that their tactical doctrine no longer applied, that their experience counted for nothing against an enemy who had moved beyond the technological framework that experience was based on. This realization that the nature of warfare had changed, that old certainties no longer held, that the enemy possessed capabilities you had not imagined possible was more demoralizing than defeat in battle. It destroyed confidence not just in specific tactics, but in the entire framework through which soldiers understood combat. And it began on a foggy morning in December 1944, when shells started falling with impossible accuracy on German forces who believed the weather protected them, who trusted in their training and experience, and who discovered that the rules of artillery fire had been rewritten without their knowledge. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.